Hi, my name is James Singer. I'm a diverse faculty fellow here at Salt Lake Community College. I'm actually an alumni of Salt Lake Community College. I did terribly in high school. I got about 2.4 GPA, and so it was like my only option was to go to SLCC. But it was the place that launched me into my academic career and pushed me into sociology. And that's what I teach here. I teach sociology and ethnic studies at Salt Lake Community College. So today what I want to talk about is something that I've been thinking a lot about lately, and that's using indigenous knowledge to try and save our planet and also change our politics. So our politics has been known for quite a few things as of late. Yelling, divisiveness, uncertainty. We see buzzwords and gridlock, and there's money and there's special interests like the fossil fuel industry and things of that nature. Our politics is emotionally charged. And the project of American democracy, I think, is at a crossroads. We're in this battle between some of our most cherished democratic institutions and also looking at the tendency towards authoritarianism. The promise of democracy is individuals and groups having equal opportunities to pursue the pursuit of happiness and the right to life and freedom. While the quality of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness has increased dramatically for those at the very top of our society, the top 10%, but specifically those in the top 1%, those in the bottom 90% have seen very little change in their lives. It also means that the gap between the wealthy and the poor is as large as it has ever been. What this means is that individuals who work for a living will have ever-increasing difficulty of experiencing social mobility or rising through the ranks of our society. It means that as inequality increases, so do antisocial behaviors and outcomes. Things like physical health and mental health, drug abuse, education, imprisonment, obesity, social mobility, trust, community life, violence, teenage pregnancy, and child well-being. We see that altruistic behavior tends to go down, which makes sense considering that the motivating force behind our current economic model posits that greed is moralized as good, or seeking one's self-interest above all else is the best thing for society. In fact, we tend to attribute our failures and successes more on our own personal actions, what we did or didn't do, than we do on those larger historical and social forces that divide us even from birth. We divorce the individual from their social reality, and in so doing, we fail in our analyses of remedies to these social problems. Obviously, money does not equate one's level of happiness. People of all socioeconomic statuses experience different levels of joy or fulfillment. Studies show that the more that one buys into the worldview of consumption, the less happy and fulfilled they feel. But also having one's basic needs secured reduces the stress level of individuals and can raise their level of happiness. The economic model of consumption also has adverse effect on the natural world around us. An economic model that is based on limitless consumption of resources on a planet with finite resources will inevitably reach a point of crisis. We are beginning to see this quite handily. A recent report from the United Nations Scientific Panel on Climate Change shows that as soon as 2040, it is highly probable we will see a world of worsening food shortages, drought, wildfires, and a mass die-off of coral reefs. It requires transforming the world economy at a speed and scale that no documented historic precedent has seen. We must reverse emissions trends and turn the world economy on a dime. Some say it's already too late. And here is where this unlikely solution comes forward. For the most part, natives tend to be the sad statistic from the effects of colonization and capitalism. We have poor health outcomes, high poverty, high unemployment, low high school graduation rates, high rates of substance abuse, missing and murdered indigenous women, and so on and so forth. But I would suggest that it is not the cultural traits of natives that lead to these outcomes. and that indigenous ways of being and knowledge have been abandoned in favor of those dominant ones. I don't believe that that's the case. Again, this is the effects of colonization and capitalism that have been imposed by the settler colonizer. Yet despite these hardships, I found a resilient and adaptive worldview that survives. For example, my grandmother, she's probably the most happy person I've ever met. This despite the fact that she's faced personal trauma and systemic oppression. She lives in a hogan, which is a traditional housing unit for the Navajo. She has no running water. She has no electricity. Life for a Navajo could be harsh and precarious, but it was also very rich. Our way of being was taught to us by the holy people. And there are two guiding principles in this Navajo worldview. The first one's called Honjon, and the other one is called K'e. Now, Honjon is the concept of walking in harmony throughout the universe. There are opposing forces or diverging forces that influence us, and we have to learn to balance them. At times when someone is severely out of balance, there are rituals that bring us back into harmony. Our very lives are guided by this central concept. We have things like the blessing wave ceremony and the enemy wave ceremony. Those are used at different times. We see some of our creation story talks about the story of when men and women were separated. And when that happened after those 4 years, it was complete and utter chaos. They had to come together and see how each other could work together. We look at the sky. The night sky is another example of this. We had one being was there carefully constructing the constellation and planning those things out, and then the impatience of Coyote came and put up the rest of the stars, and that's why we see some constellations and we see other parts that are in a very unorganized way. Now, obviously, this notion of harmony isn't found only with Navajo, but among the hundreds of tribal nations in the Americas. So this is what I did. I took this idea of Honjon and K'e and used it in a more sociological way. How can I apply this to our economic situation? It means that we're trying to manage a balance of wealth from the least fortunate to the most. It probably does not mean perfect equality because we do have differences. But even the hero twins in the Navajo stories of creation, when they were eradicating the different kinds of monsters that were terrorizing the people, they spared the world poverty and old age and cold and hunger and lice. Because with those things we learn through that adversity, and it makes us better people. They passed many tests that were given to them by their sun father. And in so doing, they received these precious objects like white shells or turquoise and jade and obsidian. But they had a calling that was higher than that. They had a calling of serving their people that surpassed the values of these precious objects. What they saw and what we're taught as Navajo is that wisdom is more precious than things. K'e is our relations to each other. It mostly refers to our clan relations and the obligations and responsibilities that are tied to these loving relations. We have respect and love. These are at the heart of these kinds of relations. So if we move beyond our clans to a broader human family and to include our Mother Earth within that, if we are to respect each other, then what I will be looking at as a sociologist are things like labor relations, the conditions of production, the extraction of resources, the transport of goods, the consumption patterns that we have in our society, the offloading of refuse. Our current social order calls for an economy that is based on greed. It is concerned with the acquisition of wealth, regardless of the costs to the masses and to the environment. It is temporary. It is short-lived. The model we can learn from, the one that I'm proposing here, is one that's based on love and respect. It's concerned with balance and harmony. It's long-term. It's resilient. So my test was to see how this might actually work in an actual political setting. So I did the crazy idea and I ran for US Congress. And I ran using familiar themes to garner legitimacy. I talked about public lands and healthcare and democracy and economic justice. But I couched them in a system of values that most people would understand, things like empathy and social responsibility and trust and cooperation and democracy. And then I related why my indigenous way of thinking and being can offer solutions to the problems we face. It's a paradigm shift based on Honjon and K'e. Now I know that it made a difference in some capacity. I had to make some hard choices. I had to make sure that I wanted to keep my fundraising low, as close to the level of poverty for a family of 4, to make a point about how skewed our system currently is. That's about $24,500. And I didn't want to go over $60,000 because that's the median income for a normal family in the United States. I wanted to prove a point that only wealthy people usually get into those positions of power, and that the voices of the masses, of the oppressed, of the middle classes, of the working classes, aren't represented in our political system. What was great is that I received endorsements from all over the place. I even got one from the Salt Lake Tribune. That was the crowning point for me. I wish I could have won, but this is the second best thing, was to see that the thing that I was doing was being validated. I saw on different occasions that people stood up. They stood with me. They came out of the woodwork. And then I also saw some allies fall by the wayside. I witnessed the brutality of a political campaign and the joy and excitement that comes from it. I heard from the rich, I heard from the poor, and everybody in between. I experienced lavish praise, and I also received death threats. I talked with liberals and progressives and moderates and conservatives and libertarians. I know that the campaign moved the needle just a little bit. We had 60% higher turnout than the last midterm election. And this was a 40 percentage point difference than what my opponent received. And it was the biggest change in all the races throughout the state. I was polled at 13% of likely voters, but ended up with over double of that at about 28%. Now, obviously, not all of this can be contributed to me and my campaign alone. There are a number of social forces at play, but I feel like the content of my message and the way I delivered it did make an impact. There are major threats to our way of life, to our society and environment, but I have the hope in the face of adversity and the courage in the face of fear. I want you to understand that the promise of democracy means that my people and all oppressed people can be seen as equals, and that our ways of thinking and being are just as legitimate as the dominant groups. It also opens doors of possibilities for how we can all solve our social problems. Currently, we are bounded by our lack of vision, both parties competing with within a certain section of the human experience. But by opening ourselves to new or different possibilities, we can imagine a much brighter future ahead of us, despite the major obstacles we are sure to face. Indigenous knowledge has answers to our most pressing problems. Our commitment to racial and gender and economic justice can elevate these voices and fulfill the promise of democracy. It will require courage. We have yet to muster. Our survival depends on it. Thank you.